On Christmas morning, my husband sent me a text that made my hands go cold. Please answer, I made a terrible mistake. I stared at those 7 words while the coffee maker hissed in my sister's kitchen, and my nieces laughed in the next room over a board game they were much too old to be playing. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply stood there in my Christmas sweater, holding my phone, trying to understand how a man who had told me to spend Christmas somewhere else was now begging me to pick up. Then a second text appeared. Emily's family knows everything. I need to come home. Emily, his ex-wife. The woman whose family had apparently been more convenient than me. I set the phone face down on the counter and took one slow breath, because by then the hurt had already done its work. The night before, I had just gotten home from church service when Tom met me in the hallway with his coat already over one arm. I remember the smell of pine from the wreath on our front door. I remember the little ceramic Santa on the entry table, the one our granddaughter painted when she was 6. I remember thinking how quiet the house felt. Then Tom cleared his throat. Emily's family invited me over for Christmas. I paused with my hand still on the banister. Emily. He looked uncomfortable but not ashamed. Your ex, I asked. He shifted his weight. Yeah. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. Tom and Emily had been divorced for nearly 45 years. They had married too young, separated before either of them truly knew how to be married, and moved on with their lives. At least that was what I had always believed. What about me, I asked. He sighed in the way men do when they want a conversation to end before it begins. It'd be easier if you spent Christmas with your own family. My own family, as if after 38 years of marriage I was still some visitor passing through his life. I looked at him for a long moment, not yelling, not crying, just looking. When you reach 68 years old, you learn there are certain moments when anger only gives people something to defend against. Silence, on the other hand, makes them hear themselves. Tom looked away first. It's not a big deal, he said. Emily's brother is in town and they asked me weeks ago. I didn't want to make it awkward. Weeks ago? His face changed slightly. That was when I understood this hadn't been a sudden invitation. It had been a decision he had made without me. I could have asked more questions. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you say yes? Why does her family get Christmas while your wife gets an excuse? But standing there under the soft glow of our hallway lamp, I felt something inside me settle. I had spent too many years explaining pain to someone who should have recognized it without a map. So I smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, just enough. Have fun, I said. Tom blinked. That's it. Yes. Margaret. You don't want awkward, remember? He opened his mouth, then closed it. I walked past him into the kitchen and began putting away the cranberry bread I had baked that afternoon. A ridiculous thing to do, maybe. But ordinary tasks can keep a woman from falling apart. 10 minutes later, I heard the front door close. He left. No argument. No apology. No second thought. I stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum. Then I took out my suitcase. My sister Ruth lived 40 minutes away in a brick ranch house full of noise, grandchildren, cookies, and people who still asked whether I wanted tea before assuming I would make it. When I called, she knew something was wrong immediately. Come over, she said. I didn't explain. I didn't ask you to. That is the blessing of sisters. By the time I arrived, Ruth had already made up the guest room and placed a quilt at the foot of the bed. Her husband Bill kissed my cheek and pretended not to notice my red eyes. Their grown children welcomed me without questions. That night, while everyone slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan. I thought about my marriage. Not just the Christmas insult. All of it. The years of being steady. The years of being reasonable. The years of saying it's fine when it wasn't fine at all. Tom had not always been careless. When we married, he was gentle, funny, a little shy. He brought me coffee on cold mornings and left notes in my lunch bag. He cried when our first grandchild was born. He held my hand through my mother's funeral. But somewhere in the long middle of marriage, appreciation had become assumption. He assumed I would understand. Assumed I would adjust. Assumed I would forgive before he apologized. And maybe I had helped teach him that. Because I had always returned peace to the room before anyone else had to earn it. Christmas morning began softly. Ruth's house smelled of cinnamon rolls and bacon. Snow dusted the shrubs outside. For a little while, I let myself enjoy the warmth of being wanted. Then my phone buzzed. Tom. I ignored the first text. Then came the second. Then a call. Then another. Finally, Ruth looked across the kitchen at me. Is that him? Yes. What does he want? I turned the phone over and read the screen again. Please answer. I made a terrible mistake. My chest tightened. Ruth came closer. Are you going to answer? I looked toward the living room where family laughter filled the house. Then I looked back at the phone. I don't know yet. Because whatever had happened at Emily's family Christmas, I already knew one thing. For the first time in our marriage, Tom was sitting with the discomfort he had handed to me. And I was not going to rush across town just to make it easier. Tip teola parte. Tom called again before noon. I watched his name flash across the screen while my youngest great-nephew proudly showed everyone the gingerbread house he'd spent 2 hours decorating. The timing couldn't have been stranger. One house was filled with warmth. The other apparently had fallen apart. I silenced the call. A minute later, another text arrived. Please, just let me explain. I slipped my phone into my purse. For nearly 4 decades, I had answered Tom's calls almost immediately. When his car broke down, when he misplaced his wallet, when work overwhelmed him, when his father passed away. I had always been there. Today, for the first time, I wasn't. Not because I wanted revenge, because I finally understood that constantly rescuing someone can prevent them from understanding the consequences of their own choices. Ruth quietly handed me another cup of coffee. You don't have to decide anything today. I know. You've spent enough Christmases taking care of everyone else. I smiled faintly. She wasn't wrong. After lunch, while the younger children played outside in the snow, I sat near the fireplace looking through old family photographs Ruth had scattered across the coffee table. One picture stopped me. Tom and I were standing beside the lake house 22 years earlier. He had one arm around my shoulders. I was holding the keys with the biggest smile imaginable. People often assumed Tom had bought that little house. He never corrected them. Neither did I. The truth was much simpler. After 30 years of teaching elementary school, I had quietly invested part of every paycheck. Not glamorous investments, safe ones, municipal bonds, dividend funds, certificates of deposit. While friends upgraded cars every few years, I kept driving the same dependable sedan. While neighbors remodeled kitchens, I paid extra toward our retirement accounts. Eventually, those careful decisions allowed us to buy the lake house outright. Tom loved telling people how peaceful it was. Few people knew whose planning had made it possible. I never minded. Marriage wasn't supposed to keep score. At least that's what I believed. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Tom. It was our daughter, Melissa. Mom. Hi, sweetheart. You okay? I'm with Aunt Ruth. I know. She hesitated. Dad called me. That surprised me. What did he say? He asked if I'd heard from you. And I told him I had. I waited. He sounded shaken. Melissa rarely exaggerated. If she said shaken, he was shaken. Did he tell you what happened? No. He only said Christmas didn't go the way he expected. I looked toward the falling snow outside the window. Neither had mine. After hanging up, I found myself wondering what could possibly have happened. Emily had always seemed pleasant enough from the little I knew about her. Their marriage had ended decades before I ever met Tom. She had remarried, then divorced again years later. Every now and then, she sent Tom a Christmas card. That never bothered me. People can remain civil after divorce. But spending Christmas together, without telling your wife until the last minute, that crossed a line. Late that afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of me. Not enough to call Tom. Enough to call someone else. My longtime friend Diane lived 2 streets away from Emily's older sister. Small towns have remarkable ways of connecting people. Diane, I said, after she answered, this may sound strange. 20 minutes later, she called back. Margaret! There was something in her voice I'd never heard before. What? I think I know what happened. I sat down. Tell me. Apparently, Emily's family Christmas had started exactly as Tom imagined. Everyone welcomed him warmly. Old stories. Old photographs. Old memories. Emily's brother joked that some people were simply meant to find their way back together. Everyone laughed, including Tom. I closed my eyes. That hurt more than I expected. Then Diane continued. But after dinner, she paused. Things changed. Emily's brother began asking Tom about retirement, whether he still owned the lake house, how much equity remained in our home, whether he'd already updated his estate planning. I frowned. What? Margaret, they thought you and Tom were practically separated. My stomach tightened. They what? Emily apparently believed things between you two had been falling apart for years. I could hardly speak. But that's not true. I know. Another pause. Someone gave them the wrong impression. Or perhaps someone had never corrected the impression. Diane continued. They kept talking about how nice it would be if old families became one family again. I felt cold despite the fire burning beside me. Then came the sentence that explained everything. Emily's brother apparently said, "Once everything's settled, you two could finally spend every Christmas together again." Everything. Settled. Not feelings. Not forgiveness. Everything. Assets. Retirement. Property. Future. Tom finally realized what everyone else in that room had quietly assumed. They weren't celebrating nostalgia. They were planning a future. One that seemed to leave me out entirely. According to Diane, he stood up so abruptly that his chair tipped backward. He corrected them immediately. He said we weren't separated. He said he loved his wife. He said coming there had been a terrible mistake. The room went silent. Emily herself reportedly looked embarrassed. She admitted she thought my marriage had already been ending. Tom left before dessert. He had spent less than 4 hours at the gathering. Then the phone calls began. Now his desperation finally made sense. He hadn't simply had an unpleasant Christmas. He had been forced to see how easily one careless decision could create an entirely false story about his marriage. And worse, he realized he had helped create that story himself. That evening, as Ruth and I cleaned the kitchen together, my phone rang again. Tom. This time I answered. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "Margaret." His voice cracked. "I need to come home." I leaned against the counter. "You already know where home is." Then I waited to hear what he would say next. He didn't answer my question right away. Instead, I heard him take a slow, shaky breath. "I don't deserve to call it home after what I did." It was the first completely honest sentence I'd heard from him in a long time. I remained quiet. Sometimes silence invites people to tell the truth. "Margaret," he continued, "I never intended to hurt you. I believe that. And yet I did." Yes, neither of us raised our voices. After nearly 4 decades of marriage, anger had lost much of its usefulness. Disappointment hadn't. "I've been sitting in the church parking lot for almost an hour," he admitted. "Why?" "I didn't know where else to go." Christmas lights reflected faintly through Ruth's kitchen window while I listened. "I kept thinking about what happened," he said. "I thought I was accepting an invitation. What I actually did was make my wife feel like she wasn't invited into her own marriage." His words lingered. Not because they erased the pain, because they acknowledged it. There is a tremendous difference. I should have realized it the moment I told you to spend Christmas somewhere else. "You should have." "I don't have an excuse." "No." Another long silence settled between us. Then he asked quietly, "Will you come home tonight?" I looked around Ruth's warm kitchen. My sister was pretending not to listen while drying dishes. Bill was helping the grandchildren build another fire outside. For the first time in years, nobody expected me to solve anyone else's emotional mess. "No." He didn't argue. "I understand. I'll come home tomorrow." "Okay. But we're going to have a conversation we've postponed for years." "I know. And this time you're going to listen." "I will." When we hung up, I noticed something unusual. I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. Because for once I wasn't swallowing my feelings to preserve someone else's comfort. That evening, Ruth and I sat beside the fireplace after everyone had gone to bed. She handed me a mug of hot chocolate. "Feel better?" "I feel clearer," she nodded. "That's different." "It is." For a few moments we watched the fire. Then she smiled knowingly. "You know what always bothered me?" "What?" "The way people talked about Tom taking care of everything." I laughed softly. "So did I." Over the years I'd heard it countless times. "Tom bought that beautiful lake house. Tom really planned well for retirement. Tom always seems to have everything under control." I'd simply smiled. Not because the compliments were true. Because correcting people never seemed worth embarrassing my husband. Ruth shook her head. "You let him have credit for things you built together." I stared into my cup. "Sometimes not even together." That surprised even me. The words had slipped out before I realized I'd been carrying them for years. She looked at me carefully. "What do you mean?" I smiled sadly. "The investment account. The cabin. The retirement fund. I started all of those." She didn't seem surprised. I figured. "I just never wanted marriage to become a scoreboard." "It shouldn't." She leaned closer. "But pretending your contributions don't exist isn't humility. It's invisibility." That sentence stayed with me long after we went to bed. Invisibility. Maybe that was exactly what had happened. Not overnight. Gradually. Quietly. One unnoticed sacrifice after another. The next morning I drove home. Snow still covered the fields outside Columbus. The roads were nearly empty. Christmas had always been my favorite holiday. This year the drive felt strangely symbolic, like I was returning to the same house. But not the same marriage. Tom's truck sat in the driveway. He was waiting on the front porch despite the cold. The moment he saw my car, he stood. He looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot. His beard hadn't been shaved. He looked older than he had 3 days earlier. When I stepped out of the car, he didn't rush toward me. He simply waited. I wasn't sure you'd come. I said I would. I know. He reached for my suitcase. I handed it to him without speaking. Inside the house looked exactly as I'd left it. Except for one thing. The Christmas tree lights were off. Tom noticed me looking. I couldn't bring myself to turn them on. I removed my coat. Neither of us mentioned Emily. Not yet. Instead, we sat across from one another at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of ordinary mornings. Finally, I spoke. Tell me everything. He didn't hesitate. He described arriving at Emily's sister's house. The hugs. The laughter. The old photographs. The stories from high school. At first, he'd felt nostalgic. Comfortable. Safe. I convinced myself it was harmless. I listened. Then he described the conversation after dinner. Questions about retirement. About the lake house. About our home. About whether I'd be all right on my own. He lowered his eyes. I realized they thought we were already finished. Why would they think that? He swallowed hard. Because I never talked about you. That answer caught me completely off guard. What? When they asked how you were, he paused. I usually change the subject. Why? I honestly don't know. He rubbed his forehead. Maybe because talking about ordinary happiness never seemed interesting. I felt my heart sink. So eventually, they assumed there wasn't any. He nodded. I accidentally erased you. The kitchen became very quiet. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Because I suddenly understood something. Neglect doesn't always begin with cruelty. Sometimes it begins with omission. With failing to speak someone's name. With forgetting to mention the person who quietly makes your life possible. Tom reached into his jacket pocket. I found this in my glove compartment. He unfolded a folded Christmas card. I'd written it for him weeks earlier. He had never opened it. He stared at it for several seconds before finally reading the first line. Then tears quietly filled his eyes. He read the first line twice before looking up at me. I never even opened it. No. His voice broke. I don't remember putting it in the glove compartment. I do. He looked confused. You said you were in a hurry to buy wrapping paper. I smiled sadly. So I slipped the card into your truck because I knew you'd see it before Christmas. He lowered his head. I forgot. There are moments in a marriage when forgetting hurts more than betrayal. Not because it's louder. Because it's quieter. Quiet enough to become a habit. Tom finally opened the card completely. Inside, in my own handwriting, were the words I'd written nearly 3 weeks earlier. To the man I've chosen every Christmas for 38 years. No matter where life takes us, I hope home will always be wherever we're together. Love, Margaret. He covered his eyes. I don't deserve this. I didn't answer. Because whether he deserved forgiveness wasn't the question anymore. The real question was whether anything had truly changed. After several minutes, he folded the card carefully and placed it back on the table. I've been thinking about something ever since yesterday. What? You never asked me if I still loved Emily. I looked at him. No. Why not? Because that wasn't what hurt. He frowned. I don't understand. I leaned back in my chair. If you'd left to be with another woman because you loved her, that would have been one kind of pain. He nodded slowly. But you left because you assumed I'd understand. His shoulders sank. You didn't think about me at all. That sentence landed harder than anything else I'd said. Because it was true. Not cruel. Simply true. I've spent 2 days asking myself how I became that man, he whispered. I looked across the table at the man I'd shared nearly 4 decades with. His hair was almost completely white now. The lines around his eyes had deepened over the years. He wasn't a bad man. But somewhere along the road he'd become a careless one. And carelessness left unchecked can wound just as deeply. I think I know when it started, he said quietly. The year you retired. I waited. People stopped asking about your work. He gave a tired smile. They started asking about mine instead. I listened. I got used to being the one everyone noticed. He swallowed. And I stopped noticing that nobody was noticing you. That was the most honest thing he'd said all week. For years, I'd quietly disappeared behind the role of supportive wife. I'd organized family reunions, remembered birthdays, managed holidays, balanced our finances, maintained friendships, kept traditions alive. None of those things came with applause. They simply became expected. Tom looked toward the living room. The Christmas tree still stood there, decorated exactly as I'd left it. I kept thinking about Emily's brother. What about him? He asked me who handled our investments. I smiled faintly. And I started answering. He laughed bitterly. Then I realized I couldn't. I raised an eyebrow. He asked about the retirement accounts. I didn't know. He asked who found the lake house. I couldn't honestly say it was me. He asked who insisted we pay off the mortgage early. Again he shook his head. I kept realizing the answer was you. His eyes met mine. For years I've accepted credit for a life you quietly built beside me. Beside me, not behind me. Beside me. That single correction mattered. More than he probably realized. I never asked for credit. I know. But I should have given it. He stood and walked into the den. A moment later he returned carrying a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. Davidson Bank. The box where we kept important papers. Tom placed it on the table between us. I opened this yesterday. Inside were decades of documents, closing papers, investment statements, insurance records, retirement plans. Every signature told the same story. Mine, 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 ours, mine. He looked embarrassed. I never realized how much you handled. You never needed to. I should have wanted to. That answer gave me hope, not because it fixed the past, because it acknowledged it. Late that afternoon, our daughter Melissa stopped by. She hugged me first, then her father. The three of us sat in the living room drinking coffee while snow drifted outside. Eventually, Melissa broke the silence. Dad told me what happened. Tom nodded. He also told me he was an idiot. That made all three of us laugh for the first time in days. Then Melissa grew serious. You know what bothered me the most? Tom looked at her. You asked Mom to spend Christmas somewhere else. She shook her head slowly. I can't imagine Dad ever saying that to Grandma. Neither could I. Tom rubbed his face. I've replayed those words 100 times. I believe you. Melissa reached over and squeezed his hand. But believing you're sorry isn't the same as pretending it never happened. No. It's going to take time. I know. When she left that evening, Tom walked her to the door. I remained in the living room watching the lights on the Christmas tree. For the first time in years, I wasn't wondering whether I mattered. I already knew I did. The question now was whether Tom could prove he knew it too. Because apologies begin healing, but only consistent actions rebuild trust. And over the months that followed, he would have to show me that Christmas had changed more than just one holiday. It had changed him. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The Christmas tree disappeared. The decorations were packed away. Life settled into its familiar rhythm again. Only this time something important had changed. Not overnight. Not because of one apology. Because of hundreds of small choices. Tom no longer assumed I would organize every family gathering. Instead, he asked, "What can I help with?" The first time he said those words, I almost laughed. Not because they sounded strange. Because I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard them. He started handling grocery shopping every Saturday morning. He learned how to balance our monthly budget instead of simply signing whatever paperwork I placed in front of him. He called our daughter without me reminding him. He even surprised me one afternoon by inviting my sister Ruth over for dinner. Not because he wanted company, because he wanted to thank her. As we cleared the dishes that evening, I overheard him telling Bill something that stopped me in my tracks. I almost lost my marriage because I confused comfort with appreciation. Bill nodded thoughtfully. A lot of men do. I don't ever want to make that mistake again. Those weren't words spoken for my benefit. He didn't know I could hear him. That made them mean even more. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Emily called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Margaret? Her voice sounded hesitant. It's Emily. I know. There was an awkward silence, then she sighed. I owe you an apology. I listened quietly. I honestly believed your marriage had been falling apart. Tom told me. He never corrected that impression. I know. Another pause. When he arrived at Christmas, I thought I was welcoming an old friend. Her voice became softer. I had no idea he had barely spoken to you about coming. I believe you. She sounded relieved. I've spent months feeling terrible. So has Tom. A faint laugh escaped her. I imagine he has. Then she surprised me. You know, people always think old love is the greatest threat to a marriage. I waited. It isn't. No, it's forgetting to protect the love that's already beside you. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt genuine peace regarding Emily. She hadn't been my enemy. She had simply become part of a misunderstanding that Tom himself had allowed to grow. We spoke for another 15 minutes before wishing each other well. When I hung up, I realized I felt lighter. Some chapters really do belong in the past. By early summer, Tom suggested we spend a weekend at the lake house. The same lake house where we'd created decades of memories. This time I hesitated. He noticed. "If you're not ready." "It isn't that." "What is it?" "I don't want to go back pretending nothing happened." He nodded. "We won't." So we went. The lake looked exactly as it always had. Morning mist floated across the water. Loons called in the distance. The old wooden dock creaked beneath our feet. We sat there with 2 mugs of coffee as the sun slowly climbed above the trees. Tom reached into his backpack. "I have something for you." It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't flowers. It wasn't an expensive gift. It was a small leather journal. Inside the cover he had written, "The woman who quietly built our life deserves to have her story remembered." The following pages contained handwritten memories. The day we met. Our first apartment. The birth of our daughter. The afternoon we bought the lake house. Only this time, every story acknowledged what he had once overlooked. Margaret found the investment opportunity. Margaret insisted we keep saving. Margaret believed in our future before I did. I looked at him with tears in my eyes. "You wrote all this?" "I've been working on it since January." "Why?" "Because I spent too many years letting people think I built this life alone." He smiled sadly. "I never want our grandchildren to make that mistake." A few months later, our entire family gathered for Thanksgiving. Nothing extravagant. Just family. Melissa stood and raised her glass before dinner. "I want to say something." Everyone grew quiet. She smiled at both of us. "This year reminded me that strong marriages aren't the ones that never face disappointment." She looked at her father. "They're the ones where people are willing to admit when they've been wrong." Then she looked at me. "And where forgiveness is given wisely, not cheaply." Tom reached across the table and took my hand. Not dramatically. Not for show. Simply because he wanted to. For the first time in many years I felt seen. Not as the woman who handled everything quietly. Not as the dependable wife everyone assumed would always understand. Simply as Margaret. The woman he'd chosen. The woman he almost forgot to choose again. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if I regret not answering Tom's first desperate call that Christmas morning. My answer always surprises them. No. Because if I had rushed to comfort him immediately, he would never have fully understood what it felt like to be left alone. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is allow them to experience the consequences that teach them to become better. That Christmas changed our marriage forever. Not because it nearly ended, because it finally became honest. If this story reminded you of someone you love, don't wait for a holiday or a crisis to tell them how much they matter. The people who quietly stand beside us year after year deserve our gratitude while they're still there to hear it. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who may need the reminder and subscribe for more stories about family forgiveness, second chances, and the quiet strength that holds a home together.